Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would answer some patron emails. This email is from annual patron Sarah, and she said, "You said you were interested in dreams we had of you guys, so here you go." Yeah, chiming in here, I am interested in these dreams. I dream of the podcasters and YouTubers that I follow as well. Yeah, you dream about what you experience, and if you experience podcasters and YouTubers, then you're going to dream about that. I was traveling somewhere when I realized I was in the area of where you lived. How I knew that, I don't know. I turned off onto this long driveway in an industrial area, which led me to a clearing where your house was, and there was a bunch of cars parked in the front lawn. A big party was in full swing. Well, sounds fun. I wonder if that's related to, I've already read through this, and it makes me wonder if there are little bits and pieces of memories that are cropping up in the dream, because I have talked about how I am the party house, if you will. I've always enjoyed throwing parties, even when I was a kid. I would have these big birthday parties that my mom would organize. So maybe that was what was cropping up in your dream. Going on. I was going to turn back when I thought, fuck it, when's the next time I'm going to be around here? And I parked my car. I'm glad you did that, Sarah. The weirdest part of your house was that it was surrounded by a roller coaster that made a lot of noise. I walked up some stairs to a porch and was observing everyone when I heard two guys talking about the podcast. I realized this was a party with a bunch of the listeners. I didn't want anyone to notice that I was party crashing, so I introduced myself and said, "Man, how can he concentrate with all this noise? And how have we never heard the roller coaster in the recordings?" One of the other guys answers, "It's totally Kirk to live next to an amusement park," which completely baffled me, so I decided to keep going. Yeah, I'm glad that baffles you. It's totally Kirk to live next to what? Yeah. I went into the house where there were probably around 20 people milling about, and then you came from the back room in the kitchen, and you were holding a platter of various meats to put on the grill, and I just nonchalantly said, "Hi, Kirk," although I was freaking out inside. Not only because I was excited to see you, but because I was also not invited. Your hair was a bit longer, and you were seemingly a little stressed, and you replied, "Oh, hey," and headed to the grill out front. Just chiming in. Sorry that I was rude to you, annual patron Sarah. I wish in the dream I would have stopped and said a more heartfelt hello. But, that can happen. So I think I do try when people arrive to, even if I am busy, there's a section of the party hours that I will actually orient myself towards the door. Stacy is a wonderful host and a nice person, but I'm more extroverted. And a lot of times the people that are coming are connected with me. Although, anyway, and so I will really try to greet people thoroughly when they come in, because, you drive all the way out, even if it's across town in Seattle, it could be 45 minutes with traffic, and it could be raining outside, and you finally kind of come into the home. I don't know. You want people to feel welcome. And I come from the tradition of having those kind of manners, I guess. I'll never forget, I would play with this Dungeons and Dragons group, and or people would arrive, or me included, and no one would say hello. We would play D&D every week, and maybe I would be the first one there, and I would say hello to the dungeon master. And then as people would come in, I would say hello. No one else would even acknowledge that the other, even though we're friends, these are people that at the very least have walked into a room and acknowledged it. And I'm big on, I think my parents were instrumental in helping me, because it's not just for manners. It's not just rules that you're following. It's courtesy. It's accounting for what's happening emotionally for people. When you enter a room, even though you might look like you're nonchalant, you're probably like, am I welcome here? Are people okay to see me? Yeah, just a little bit of politeness goes a long way. Anyway, I was looking around to see if there were any other hosts around, but alas, there weren't. But Stacy and an older woman rounded the corner. We locked eyes, so I introduced myself to the older lady first and was told that she was your aunt. She had these super wise eyes, like she could read into my soul. And I thought for sure the gig was up and I would be thrown out. Just chiming in. I wonder if this is related to when my Auntie Carol told me that as a young person, as a 3-4-year-old boy, she thought that I could see into her soul, because she would tell me that later, that I had this very intense look. I think I was just daydreaming or something as a kid, because I don't think I was a particularly wise child. But I wonder if that's where that little memory is coming up. Anyway, so the aunt was the one who could read your soul. And my Auntie Carol is a very wise, smart person. She's extremely smart. But she seemed to accept me and put her hand on my arm, signaling I was welcome. She then went to everyone else and either told them to go, whispering something in their ear, or put a hand on their arm saying that they could stay. Just I find that to be really interesting. It's like this arbiter of who can stay. I then started chatting with Stacy and wanted to show her pictures of my dogs on my phone, which in natural dreamland physics was not working properly. And although I have a gazillion pictures of them, I could not manage to find a decent one on my phone. This discrepancy made me realize I was dreaming and I woke up. Yeah, just chiming in here. A newer phenomenon in dreams is dreaming about phones, right? And I've talked about this before, and this is just my theory or my hypothesis. I have not, to my memory, read research on this, but I surmise that when we are dreaming, we are laying the tracks out in front of the train as it's barreling down the tracks. And we only can handle building the world, because, in the dream, we identify with ourselves typically. We are the observer of the world and the other people. But our brain also has to, so our brain is paying attention to the consciousness of the us character in the dream, the me character. And we're thinking about how we're perceiving things and maybe decisions that we're going to make. But we're also creating the entire world. We're creating all the characters. We're creating their motivations. We're creating what they say. We're creating the room we're in and the temperature and the lighting and, the roller coaster and the meat on the tray. Like you created. All that is you. So it is taxing on the brain, and it is impossible for the brain to create an entire field of text like in a book, or an entire set of pictures with detail in a phone. We can dream of the phone, but it's too much to ask our brain to also populate that phone with all the normal data that you would expect to have on a phone when you open up the phone and you open up the Photos app. So that's where dreams will break down. And it is a good way to lucid dream, because if you're dreaming and you pick up a book and you just flip to a random page and you try to read, in all likelihood, you're not going to see what you expect to see, which is a full page of text, right? Because your brain can't lay the tracks out. Anyway, so maybe that's what happened to you, but going on. I had a few dreams of you and Umberto in the past, but never could remember them well enough to write them down. I find it totally surreal when I dream of people I've never met before, but it's fun all the same. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for the podcast. It has helped me to be a better person. End of email. End of email. All right. Well, let's take a break. When we get back, more emails. We're back from the break. This next email is from patron Haley from the internet. She says she's from patron Haley from the internet. She says, I'm excited to hear about your dyslexia journey. We seem to share a lot of the same anecdotes. I am not diagnosed, but I scored as having significant risk on the online assessment test. It's something I've questioned my whole life, but skimmed through life unnoticed. Have you tried the Dyslexia font? It's apparently quite helpful for many people. I don't find it works for me too well. Just chiming in. Yeah, I Googled it, and I haven't tried it out very much, but I can't imagine it helping much. Maybe it helps. You can Google it yourself. The font is, I don't know the word for it, simpler or something. It doesn't have all of the serifs and all the little accoutrements, the fancy bits on the letters. Maybe it helps. It also spreads out the letters more than average, I would say. But I can't imagine a font really fixing anything because it's not about the font. It's just the way my brain works. I've actually thought of new things related to dyslexia that I think are related to dyslexia. Or I should say, I've thought of new experiences that I think are related to dyslexia. One thing that I've noticed about me is that when I'm playing a video game that has a storyline, it's nearly impossible for me to follow the story. I've always been boggled by, I was just on another podcast. They interviewed me about Baldur's Gate 3. It's a D&D video game. And I was really, really into that game. And I spent a lot of time absorbing and paying attention to the storylines and stuff. But the person that was interviewing me was recalling different storylines in Baldur's Gate 3. And he knew details, and he played the same game that I did. And, that game has a lot of different branches, so everyone experiences a different version of the story. But some of the storylines I played, he was recalling, and he remembered and could identify details that just went over my head, and I was paying attention. And I don't know, but I think it might be related to dyslexia, because I've always thought that everyone must be reading, because often they'll write like a novel. Like with Halo, there are like Halo novels that you can read. And I always figured that everyone was reading all this extracurricular stuff because the level of detail that they comprehended of the story was way beyond what I comprehended. And I tended to conclude that everyone else is just nerds about it and spending more time getting into the story outside of the game. And also that these game makers just aren't very good at telling a comprehensive or comprehensible story. But I think it's possible that my brain just doesn't retain or understand or encode or something, partially because a lot of these story beats are through text, right? You have these text dialogues. You have 4 options to say something. And I think it's quite possible that I, in the moment, am able, like whenever there's a lot of dialogue, like there were some really great games that people would recommend for the Game Boy, for example, like with Pokemon and that sort of thing, or other early RPGs in the 90s and aughts. And I just could not play those games because it was just so much reading. I would, at the time, think I was just impatient or there's just too many words. But, these were games that 7-year-olds are playing, and I just couldn't handle the amount of words. And I think that that's related. Another thing that seems quite obvious, but I don't know if I mentioned it in my longer episode about dyslexia, that I hate long emails. I've always hated the sort of email that you get at work where someone says, "Hey, how's it going? How's your weekend? Boy, the weather's really been this and that. I've been dealing with my dog lately, d, and remember that meeting and blah 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 blah." And then at the very end of the email, there's the thing that you need to know, which is, "Oh, and by the way, we need to reschedule tomorrow's meeting because this and that. So if you could get back to me about a alternative time." And it would just drive me nuts to the point where at a certain point I became a prima donna and would say, "I don't care if I miss some important detail. If you don't get to the fucking point in the beginning of the email, I'm not going to read it." Because the way I framed it was, I have limited time. I'm also an impatient person, but I also have limited time. When you're program director at a university, you get so many emails. Every email gets CC'd to you, and 90% of the emails, people are just CCing you because they think they're supposed to. And I would just figure, I don't need to read this. And I just wouldn't. And that would mean I would miss out on some stuff. But I would say to people that they're like, "Oh, you didn't get that in an email?" And I'd say, "Well, did you bury it in a lot of fluff? Because if you started the email with a lot of fluff, then yeah, I get to a certain point in the paragraphs and I just figure that it's just a casual check-in email, and I guess I just didn't have time for it. And looking back, though, of course, dyslexia was involved. I can't, it's hard for me to read, and I read very slowly. And, if I can convey something about dyslexia, if you don't have it, to y'all, is that it doesn't just make it difficult. It also puts you in a bad mood because your brain is working hard, and plus all the shame involved. But even if you don't have shame about it, there's just a lot of work that your brain is doing. And when you do that, it becomes taxing, and you start to just get tired and fatigued in this way that is hard to recognize, right? Because when you get physically tired, right, you're lifting a lot of boxes. I think we understand. But our brain has only so much energy that it can deplete in a day, and the same phenomenon will happen. Anyway, so there's that. Another thing that I thought of was I've always had difficulty with subtitles in movies, right? And I always thought it was just because I was an uncultured person, because, frequently it's a foreign movie with subtitles. But of course, right, when there are subtitles, I'll miss 95% of the movie because I'm spending so much time reading. Oh, I just thought of another thing. There would be a lot of times when there would be some sort of title card, like at the beginning of the movie, where they're like, in 1943, I wouldn't get through the words before they would move on to the next thing, right? Before the movie began. And I'd be like, man, they need to leave those things up longer. And a lot of times when I'm watching at home, I pause it even reflexively without knowing how long it's going to be, because I just figure anyway, it's just another thing. Another thing that I thought of was, as a musician and a songwriter, I write lyrics last. A lot of people write lyrics first or midway through or something. I have this very noticeable, odd way of writing when it comes, and I know other writers will do this too, but I think I'm really particular at one end of the spectrum. I will write, like right now, by the way, I'm actually itching to really get back into music. One of the things that has sprouted out of getting a little bit more free time, because, I've been trying to have more work-life balance, and I've been scaling back on the YouTube channel in particular. And I've had more free time, and there are two things that have, well, really three things that come out of it. Well, really four things. Spanish English. One is my health is getting a lot better because I finally have the headspace. Even though I've always known what I should be doing, you need that brain power. You need that time to, expend the kind of energy you need to expend, not only just physically for cardio and stuff, but also just mentally of, okay, I got to make sure I eat right. And, so there's a lot of benefits to my health. There's also the benefit of being able to finish my grief book. It's going slower. I planned on having it done by 2025, but let's say I'll have it done by 2026. Let's just put it that way, and we'll see. I think there's a pretty good chance that I will, maybe this summer, 2025. Anyway, the other thing that has grown out of it is just more time to just chill and hang out and relax with my wife, the way normal people do on the weekends. The other thing that has grown out of it is music. I didn't really predict this, but what really gives me life is music and creating music and being in music and thinking about music and collaborating with others and writing music and thinking about production and getting back into playing piano and guitar and bass and drums and getting back into harmonies and collaborating with Umberto and other musicians that I am friends with, and writing lyrics to some extent. But so I'm actually gearing up to start a YouTube channel separate from Psychology in Seattle, in which it's just my music. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I have those aspirations to just have a place to put stuff as a repository of my music creations. And, and I don't know what sort of videos I'm going to make. That's kind of a daunting but challenging thing to think about, like what kind of visuals there would be. I want to keep it simple because I don't want to spend that much time on that. I'm not like a major artist or anything. It's just, and if, only 5 people are watching those videos, those music videos, and one of them happens to be my mom, that's fine with me. It's that's the way it's been my whole life. So I'm okay with that. But I just want to have that outlet. And it's been about 10 years of, and, I've done various different music projects over the last 10 years. I was in a Strokes cover band, and we were, I thought, pretty good. I was the weakest link of the whole thing, objectively. But we worked really hard, and, we had some good gigs. If you're familiar with the Crocodile in Seattle, we had a big weekend gig at the Crocodile with, hundreds of people there and great sound system and everything. That's not like a Coliseum level, but it's a big deal to be in Seattle. And I've played there before, not to brag, but I guess I am. Anyway, so it's been a long time since I've been in that rhythm of writing and production and songwriting. Anyway, so one of the things that I've always noticed about myself compared to other songwriters is that I almost procrastinate about writing lyrics. I always thought the reason was because I'm just not a poet. Because, there are some really good wordsmiths. It's funny because I can't come up with the words to describe good wordsmiths. But I don't know. I think that there are some lyrics that I am, at least to myself on my own standard, a little proud of at times. I also can detect good lyrics, Now, I'm not saying I'm a good lyricist. That's not where my strengths are. My strengths really aren't in any musicianship. I think my strength is in songwriting, honestly. Like, if I could get musicians just to play my music, include singing, I would be happy with that. It's just hard to get people to do that kind of thing. Anyway, so I'm saying all this because there have been many times where, as we're going into the recording studio, I'm scribbling out lyrics of songs that I've played with my band or myself for years, and on stage or just, during rehearsal, I am just making up syllables. In fact, there was this one song where I couldn't come up with lyrics, so I just used the gibberish that I had normally sang when we would rehearse. It was a song called Carnival, and it had this beginning line with the cadence of coming down. So I'll just tell you what I would say as it's sort of like with Paul McCartney when he's writing Yesterday. Originally it was called like Spaghetti, or no, what was it called? It was called some sort of food. I can't remember what it was called, but before he had the words, he would just sing these nonsensical words as filler, knowing that you would later actually write lyrics. Anyway, so the opening line that I would say during rehearsal was, coming down Minnesota Raya. Minnesota Raya. What does that even mean? Nothing. And I figured, well, I'll fill in regular words there. Well, as we're heading into the studio, I'm frantically writing lyrics to that song and like 5 other songs, and I never had the time, and I just said, screw it, I'll just say that. So I did. So in the song, the recording, it's coming down Minnesota Raya, and I was okay with that. And so I think that has to do with dyslexia too, because I don't know if it's just like because of the mild trauma of being dyslexic in school and stuff, of just being scared or being averse to verses, or if my brain just has a hard time wrapping my mind around. The other thing about lyrics is that when I'm listening to songs, I don't comprehend lyrics well. There'll be songs by Fleetwood Mac, for example, that I have listened to and sung along with for literally 40 years or 45 years. And Stacy and I will be at the mall, and the song will come over the intercom, and Stacy will sing along with a little line. And this happens all the time, by the way, not just with Fleetwood Mac, but with Green Day or something. And she'll sing the little line, and I'll sing what I know not to be. I know the lyrics are not that, but I'll just, because I have like my set of lyrics that I think it is, but I just know it's not because it's nonsensical. Anyway, and we'll both be kind of singing along, and then I'll stop and I'll turn to her and I'll be like, what's the line there? And she'll say the line, or even she'll say, well, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's this. And it's always way more likely that her version of it. We're the same age. We've been listening and singing along with this song's the same probably, but she comprehends and understands and retains lyrics way beyond what I do. And of course, dyslexia is involved, because dyslexia isn't just the screwed up process. It's not just having difficulty with reading letters on a page, words on a page. It also just has to do with processing language, hearing language, comprehending, producing language, remembering language. It just has words. And so I just thought that was interesting, that as I'm going through my life, I'm just discovering all these little, I wonder if that has to do it. And there's all these little experiences that I didn't think were related that I always noted was odd. Because, there were other songwriters that would actually, I would marvel at them, that they would start with lyrics. They would write lyrics and then write a song over the lyrics. And I've done that a couple times, but they were always with other people's lyrics. With other people, they would write like a poem or something, friends of mine, and I would say, hey, can I write a song to that? I could do that, but I would have no interest and I would actually feel kind of like I was doing something wrong if I was trying to force the words to work, right? Because I prioritize the music and the melody and the vibe, and I want the words to conform to that, if that makes any sense. Anyway, so that's me chiming in about that. But going on with your email, Patron Haley, you say, your podcast has made me so interested in psychology that I'm back in school for it. Well, congratulations, Haley. Initially, I was hesitant because it seemed like an impossible amount of reading. It is an impossible. In fact, it's literally impossible at times in some graduate school programs, such that I recommend that people pick and choose what they're going to read. It's not uncommon for the first day of class being assigned not 3 or 4, but like 5 chapters to read in each of your classes. And the chapters are not fun to read. These are textbooks with very dense text, and it's hard to read it's hard to comprehend on a good day. So I tell, and it's totally viable. It's not cheating. In fact, even if people don't have dyslexia, I tell people do this, to be strategic about, because, if you're working full time, if, you only have so many hours. And so, do what you can, skim what is skimmable, and don't break your back, because if you are pedantic or rule following and just read every word, you might actually not be achieving what is the spirit behind the rule, which is the reading is supposed to enhance the learning, not the other way around. Anyway, so going on. Right now, I am just basic. I have an itch on my foot. I have to itch. So I'm itching it with my other foot. Right now, I just basically need to spend 2 or 3 times as long as other students to learn the information. So just chiming in. That may or may not be true, because being dyslexic, can interfere with reading speed and I suppose comprehension. But reading is not the only way you can get information into your head. Lectures, of course, are a big part of learning. Also, podcasts, like if your reading is about attachment theory or something, you could listen to my deep dive on attachment theory, and maybe it's not exactly what's in the reading, but I'm just saying there's a lot of different avenues. Or go to the professor themselves and just say, hey, can I just pick your brain for half an hour? Is that okay? Professors hopefully will make themselves available, particularly if you say, I'm dyslexic and I need some accommodation, and maybe there's some other students in the class. So maybe if we get you for 15 minutes after class, and you're paying a lot of money in graduate school, you deserve to have that service. Anyway, when students asked me to do it, I was more than happy. Going on. Do you have any tips for a bad reader to get through a degree? I kind of gave you some already. There are audio versions of the textbooks, but they seem auto-generated and so monotone that it's really hard to pay attention to them. Yeah, I can't. I've barely listened to these. I cannot imagine how impossible it would be to. I mean, certain textbooks might lend themselves to audio versions, but textbooks aren't like a novel where it's just telling a story. It's information, and there are bullet points, and there are paragraphs that are more important than others. So here's a tip that I actually, and I'm guessing for yourself, you might have done. I know a lot of people with dyslexia do this. I do this a lot, which is I would mark up the text with all sorts of, I had all these symbols that would help me to pay attention and also would remind me to go back to it. And a lot of underlining. I didn't use a lot of highlighting because for some reason that just didn't really, whatever works for you. I did a lot of mechanical pencils, right? And I had like circles and checks and crosses and X's and underlines and double circles and a circle with a check in it and a minus. And, I had all these little symbols that helped me to, as I'm reading, retain it, but also would remind me to go back to certain sections to really absorb what's being said. Also, as I'm underlining something, I'm rereading it, right? So I'm letting it kind of get in. And I think this is good for any student, whether you have dyslexia or not. So that's one. Another thing to do is to literally take notes as you're reading, or what you believe to be the most, often in a textbook, in a chapter, there will be an introduction. And then as soon as the introduction is done, usually the meat is right there in that first page or paragraph or section or something. And so taking notes on that, and maybe skimming over the introduction, or skimming over the summary, or skimming over the later part of the chapter, depending on what it kind of looks like it's getting at. But with that first really meaty section, just sitting down and looking at the text, carefully reading the topic sentences, taking some notes, going back to it, back and forth, and really make it your own, right? It's well understood that for a lot of people, by taking notes and rereading things, it can incorporate them. And really in psychology, even if you don't have dyslexia, comprehending difficult texts might be enhanced by practices like these. There's a lot of study tips that you can follow, but I'm just telling you things that I've done off the top of my head. Anyway, the other thing that I'll say is that dyslexia or not, if you don't understand if you're doing the best you can to read and you're skimming a little bit and you're attending class and you're paying attention, you're doing the assignments and you don't get it, then that's a fault of the professor. That's a fault of the program. And let's say that you're a little below average in your comprehension, or it takes you a little bit longer to learn. Well, that's okay. That's expected. That's understood. That's human. The program and the professor and the lectures and the assignments are there to set you up for success, particularly in psychology. We're not talking about a high pressure organization or a high pressure institution like, I don't know, Harvard Law. I don't know if it's like this, but like where, look, you either make it or you don't. And this is a lot of people are lining up to be in this program. Psychology isn't like that. I can't think of maybe certain research institutions, University of Washington being one of them, where there might be some competition there. But generally speaking, and particularly therapy programs, there's enough to go around. And so, and we need all the therapists that we can get in society. So there's no need to weed people out. So if the class is not effective, then one, don't shame yourself. Two, go to the professor and say, I'm not understanding, because there's a good chance that most people are not understanding the things, and you deserve to understand the things. And some professors just suck, and it's not your fault. So, do the best you can. And the learning one acquires needed to be a professional, to be a clinician, is so vast that the amount that you could even at the top, I think about the students that spent the most time really paying attention and maybe you went to school, because my university, at least in the past, you could go really slowly. You could stretch out a 3.5-year degree over 6 years, and so you could really take your time with every class. And those students that were, let's say objectively at the top of the class, they had only learned 2 or 3% what they needed to learn in order to be a well-rounded, successful, wise clinician. So even if things go a little wrong in graduate school, it doesn't really matter in the big picture. It's just, are you dedicated to learning overall, And once you're done with graduate school, there's a lot of other ways to learn, podcasting, listening to podcasts being one of them, and also just on the job, right? Anyway, going on. Let's see. Like, they don't stick to short-term memory at all. I'm curious if there's possible. I've always been comfortable poking fun at my terrible reading abilities with my close friends, but definitely something I don't disclose to my boss or colleagues. It's really nice to hear you say that you also do not read books. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I talked about this in my longer episode about dyslexia, but I would do that too. That I think I might have talked about this, or at least I'll say now that when people would ask about a certain book that I should read, or if I'm talking about a topic and they're just like, okay, what book did you read to understand this sort of stuff? I would kind of evade the question because I knew or suspected that I actually hadn't read the way that people typically read, where they will read, all these big texts and lots of research and stuff like that, and I certainly would, but the way I would read it would be kind of the way I was talking about earlier, where I would skim a lot and really hone in. Like, there's this book that I often recommend by Wallen called Attachment and Psychotherapy, and I've often talked about it this way, that in that book, there are certain paragraphs that I have bookmarked or dog-eared that I will just go to every once in a while to remind me of what the book is trying to get across. And the book's long, the book's a couple hundred pages long, pretty dense text. But for me, what's useful to me is like 5 paragraphs that are, spread throughout that book, mostly towards the beginning of the book. So you can, anyway, I would have that experience where I would notice that other people would read front to back, 3 or 4 times, whereas I never even got close to reading the book front to back even once, And so I would, at work or on the podcast or whatever, as a professor, that was the other thing. As a professor, I would have to hide things, So yeah, it's, and I don't know if I were with a bunch of professors that I didn't know, or I didn't feel safe around or something, or I just wasn't acquainted with them, I probably would obscure this part of myself out of fear of being stigmatized or being labeled as a dullard or something. Anyway, thanks for everything you do, and Bob and Umberto and Rebecca. Your parasocial pal, Ela. Ela is Haley backwards. It's how I referred to myself for the first couple years of my life. Coincidence? End of email. Yeah. So your name is Haley and Ela is Haley backwards. So coincidence? Who knows? Anyway, let's take a break. We get back, more emails. All right. So this next email is from good old patron Natasha from California. I'll summarize her email here. She talks about Seattle freeze, and also about how she recently moved up here, and she's been here for a couple of years, and now she's moving to Boston, and she's happy to leave Seattle because she has experienced some, what she calls smugness in Seattle, where people will criticize her in public. Like, she gives an anecdote in which she was in the line for the ferry, and she was confused about which line to get into, and it absolutely can be confusing because you're driving your car, you get your ticket, and you pull into this huge parking lot, and there are workers with reflective vests on telling you which line to get into, and depending on which line you get in depends on your place in the overall line getting onto the next ferry. And sometimes the line you get in can make the difference between getting on the next ferry or having to wait another hour for the next ferry. You know what I mean? So there's that. Plus, there's cars behind you. There's maybe pedestrians in front of you. It's kind of a nerve-wracking experience. And then when you get on the ferry, there's workers there that are directing traffic because there are the ferries, the boats that carry the cars and the people are apparently the Seattle ferry system is one of the biggest in the world, and these ferries are really large crafts that have a lot of capacity for cars, and so there's a lot of confusion and you have to pull into really tight spaces, and they're often trying to pack the ferry as much as possible. So there's a worker there saying like, come on forward, keep coming, because we're really trying to cram everyone in. And it can be nerve-wracking. There's cars behind you. There's a lot of tension there, and so when you pull in line, you can pretty easily get in the wrong line. And apparently, she got in the wrong line on accident, and someone came up to her car, another customer, another ferry passenger waiting in line, and said something like, "Well, it must be nice that you cheated and cut in line before everyone else." And yeah, that's pretty awful. But she also mentions the Seattle freeze and about how it's a real thing. And she also said that, she says, "Kirk, I know that you think the Seattle freeze is a myth." All right, so let's drill down on this for a second. First off, I'll say from the outset, I don't claim, and I hope I haven't claimed, that that the Seattle freeze is a myth. What I can claim quite confidently is that there's no research demonstrating that the Seattle freeze is an actual phenomenon or not. It might be, but there's no data. There's no good research. There is some research kind of on the periphery, but even if it were central to the question as to whether or not there is a Seattle freeze or not, which I'll explain in a second, you would need so many more studies to verify, because one study in psychology or social science, as we understand from the replication problems, is not enough to go off of. So there's that. So what is the Seattle freeze? Well, generally speaking, and it's not a clinical or sociological term, but the general definition is that when people move here from other places, they have a really hard time making friends or acquaintances, or that's that, or dating, I guess, I suppose, is another thing that I think people will claim is a part of the Seattle freeze. It's hard to get people to be upfront about whether or not they want to date you, or, just a lot of passivity and passive aggressiveness is also something that's attributed. It's often contrasted with a place like New York City, where, everyone's real upfront and maybe too upfront, and Seattle is the opposite. And there's a lot of history that we can get into in terms of the original white settlers that were dominant in the early days of the Seattle area, tended to be more from the northwestern parts of Europe, places like the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, and also from places like England. And so those places traditionally tend to be more uptight and more concerned about making a fool out of themselves in public, I guess, and less warm. These are generalizations, but there seems to be some credibility to that. And as new people would move to the area, including my parents, when they moved to the area, they lived in Spokane across Washington State and moved over here in the 60s, they would have to conform to the dominant culture. And as each new wave of people move to Seattle, they have to conform. So even though today, there's only a small percentage of people that are from Scandinavia or English heritage, the culture still has persisted, right? And every region in the United States can have elements of that. So that's the reasoning, or that's the explanation, I suppose. I suppose it's also in support of the theory of the Seattle freeze phenomenon. What I'll tell you is, again, the research is not there. There are some There's obviously a lot of anecdote, but there's anecdotes of all sorts of dubious claims like the earth is flat or something. So we have to actually look at data and science. And this is not a critical topic in psychology or social science. So I doubt that dissertation topics or serious researchers at universities are, one, interested in this topic, and two, they probably wouldn't receive funding to look into this because it doesn't really matter. And of the research that is out there, because there is some research looking at a broader question as to whether or not there are personality differences between people in different regions. And then you have to ask, well, how do you even measure personality? Because that's a whole other topic. And we tend to, if we do anything, we tend to measure big five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so among those dimensions across different regions in the United States, there are some minor differences. And from my memory, the differences are not what you would imagine. Like people in Seattle are not necessarily more neurotic and less open, so it's kind of all over the board. And again, it's really slight differences. And again, there would have to be more research, and that doesn't say anything about the Seattle Freeze, because there's nothing in the Big Five, the 5-factor model, that has really anything to do with being warm to acquaintances and open to friendship. I mean, maybe there's some correlations there, but there wasn't anything along those lines. Because people have been asking me to talk about the Seattle Freeze since the beginning of this podcast, because psychology and Seattle, and people are like, oh, Seattle Freeze, especially people in Seattle, especially people having moved here. I'll tell you, anecdotally, I do not find this to be my experience. As a born and raised Seattleite myself, and 98% of the people I grew up with and people in my family are also born and raised in Seattle, and maybe go back a ways, are not the way that we are stereotypically described. I'm also always skeptical of generalizations based on anecdote, particularly about groups of people, because I grew up as an Asian American having qualities attributed to me because, like people were literally afraid to fight me because this is in the 70s, they figured I knew Kung Fu or karate or something, and I would kill them instantly. It was interesting. There were two reasons why people didn't fight me. One was that, which is just hilarious, and of course today you wouldn't have that generalization, but it was there in the 70s. The other reason was I was a lot bigger than other kids. I grew much earlier than other kids did, and people were just terrified of me just because of how tall I was or whatever. And so I consequently actually didn't get that many fights. I still got in some fights, and it was older kids that would fight me. But anyway, so I certainly didn't seek out fights. Anyway, point is that I grew up with generalizations being waged against me, and I didn't appreciate that. And so I'm always skeptical of any anecdote, because to the white people in my community, they're like, well, every Asian person I know knows Kung Fu or karate and knows how to kill people with one touch. And, where do you get it? Well, I've seen a lot of Kung Fu movies, and I've seen, Karate Kid or whatever. And so anecdotally to them, then it makes sense, right? But we all understand that anecdote. Now, Asian Americans were being oppressed and still are. Are Seattleites being oppressed by being stereotyped as being cold socially? Not really. So it's a different thing here. But generally speaking, I'm always waiting for the data. Yeah, and maybe someday someone will, every time this topic comes up, I look in the research database and, look to see if anyone has done any serious research along these lines, and there still to date has not been anything along those lines. Certainly a lot of anecdote and certainly a lot of articles written. And there's also research that demonstrates a difference. There are some hypotheses, some speculations that people in Seattle are not necessarily more smug or more passive-aggressive or more cold, the Seattle Freeze phenomenon that's proposed. But they can be misinterpreted. Because people in Seattle have the same need for closeness and friendship and fun and activity as everyone else, presumably, right? And people say, well, the weather, it's always rainy, so people are always inside. And that's just not even true. Seattle is well known for outdoorsy people, hiking and biking and fishing and kayaking. People move here specifically for that. I don't actually do that. I'm actually a strange Seattleite in that I hate camping. In fact, I wasn't until I was like 35 or 40 years old. I never was public about the fact that I hated camping and would go camping with people because I just didn't want to be outed or stigmatized or attacked or something. The reason why I hate camping is because my family never went camping. And so to me, camping is just a lot of the negatives, right? Just sleeping on a lumpy thing. And also, back in the day when we would go camping in the 80s and 90s, like you would just have a sleeping bag and a tent, no padding, the kind of stuff people have now, the glamping kind of stuff, like I could maybe get into, but give me a hotel room with a nice bed and, high thread count sheets and a toilet, for Christ's sake. Anyway, so, what was I talking about? Oh, so generalizations. Now, there is some research that seems to indicate that people in Seattle are more lonely than other cities, but there are so many confounding factors. One being that a huge percentage of people living in Seattle proper in particular have recently moved here, meaning within the last 10, 15 years, for work at Amazon.com. Amazon, the workforce, in terms of the office workers and the tech people and all the marketing people and, the people who work in, not the actual drivers or the people who pack things up, the kind of laborers, all the administration, which is, thousands and thousands of people, they all work in downtown Seattle because Amazon's from Seattle and what's his face? Bezos lives in Seattle and blah, blah, blah. So now I'm sure there are satellite offices, but anyway, point is that it's possible. I don't know because there's been no research around this, that larger portion of people who are lonely could be a result of people having left their family and friends behind. Sometimes they've moved from the other side of the earth, and are lonely, and because it takes time to build friends. The other possibility is that the Seattle culture is such that it's hard to integrate yourself into the community or to get to know people, because in other areas of the world or the country, they might have other kinds of ways of having people come together. You know what I mean? Like in one town, there might be a lot of people that, I don't know, do yoga together or something, whereas in Seattle, of course, there's a lot of people. You get my point. Okay, so anyway. But what Natasha was talking about was something that isn't associated with Seattle's Fiat Freeze, as far as I know, in terms of smugness and passive aggressiveness. And is it possible that people in Seattle are less direct because of the history of our town and the way of the original white people that dominated the original Seattle city culture? Yeah, it's possible. And if that were true, then I would guess that could be attributed to a lot of regions in the area, including Vancouver, BC. The other thing that I'll say is that when I am on Reddit and I see other subreddits, I will see people complaining about their cities, like Miami or Cincinnati or New York City or San Diego. For some reason, for a while, I was getting a lot of San Diego subreddit posts, and I'm like, why am I getting a lot of San Diego? I don't care. Somehow the algorithm. And I was seeing people in other cities complain about the exact same things that they would complain about in Seattle. Everyone's a bad driver. Everyone's passive. Everyone's cold. No one wants to do anything anymore. I invited 20 people to a party and no one showed up. This town sucks. The politicians suck and the police suck and the public transport sucks. And, because there's problems. But to say that it's only in this town, right, is, perhaps not necessarily accurate. And you'll hear all sorts of stuff. I look at the Seattle subreddits, and there are posts of people saying, oh my God, the drivers here suck. But then other people say, oh my God, like I went to Atlanta and boy, do they suck at driving there. Seattle is, can be kind of bad, but it's way better than, and I don't know, Atlanta is, just picking a random city out of the hat. So I think we have this need to categorize and generalize. You'll hear, if you watch my reaction videos, whenever someone in these reality TV shows says, well, women, blah, 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 or, the difference between girls and boys, like daughters and sons, they're like this and other people like that, and you actually look into what they're basing that on. And it's like they have two kids, a daughter and a son, and the daughter is this way and the son is this way. And then they just extrapolate that to literally every human being that's ever lived. and 99.9% of the time, I know enough of the research to know that that generalization that the person is making is silly and not supported by data. For some reason, we just have this need. So when you come to a town and things go well for you or things don't go well for you, there's this temptation to say that it's generalizable to literally every, millions of people that live in the Seattle area. It's not like several millions, but, I can't remember, like 4 million in this greater Seattle area. Anyway, so there's that. Now, is the Seattle freeze possible? I don't know. We just, there's no data. If there were comprehensive, multiple studies, would there potentially be some signal there? Yeah, maybe. But it would be a slight difference in bell curve. I imagine that whenever you move to any town, it's hard. It's challenges. And we know that people in general across the United States and in other countries as well are becoming more lonely. It's not just people in Seattle, it's people all over. It's a general average, right? Certainly there's a lot of people that are not, lonely. And of course, I'm biased because I love my town and I love all the people that I love here. Most of everyone I know lives here, family and friends and all the places, most of the people that I grew up with still live here. A friend of mine that I went to preschool with, and we went through every step of the way in school together. We even went to college together, and we even lived in the same frat. He lives right down the street. I see him all the time. I've known him for 52 years. So I love these people, and yeah, I'm a little defensive about it. And it's not my experience, me and a lot of people I know, people in my family, are at the very least not below average in terms of warmth and openness. But, who knows? Are people in Seattle more smug? Somehow I doubt that. Somehow I imagine in any town you're going to find assholes. So that's just a guess. But we'd have to look at the data. But at the very least, Natasha from California, it sounded like your time in Seattle sucked. And that your experience with people in Seattle sucked, which sucks. And there's no denying that. The anecdotes you gave were pretty clear, and you were not at fault, like, the example of the fairy line thing. And I'm sorry that happened to you. It's not my fault it happened to you, of course, because, that wasn't me that did that. I didn't put him up to it. But, as someone that I guess talks well of Seattle, maybe it even affected. Well, geez, is that true, Natasha? Did you come to Seattle because I talk well of Seattle? Then it could be my fault. If it is, I apologize. But anyway, it sounds like, you're going to Boston, and I hear people are great in Boston, but I hear they're different. but they might not be all that different. Who knows? It kind of just roll the dice, I guess I really hope that the roll of the dice of your interactions with people in Boston go way better, because you deserve to have a good life. Anyway, one more email. All right, this next email is from long-term patron Jane from Yorkshire, UK. I assume I'm pronouncing that right, Yorkshire. It's spelled Yorkshire, right? But it's Yorkshire, right? Anyway, she emails in and says, please say something kind for people with paranoid personality disorder. I heard you discussing avoidant personality disorder, which I also have. Your idea about the originating forces behind avoidant personality disorder were great. Almost everything written about paranoid personality disorder is horrible. I am not a horrible person. I struggle immensely. I struggle to trust people. And skipping to the end, I'm seeing that she's saying, I'm crying as I write this. I'm so exhausted with my life. Yeah, so I will do a deep dive on paranoid eventually. I want to, this year in 2025, I have aspirations of doing 3 deep dives, for sure, and maybe several more. But I want to do paranoid. I want to do antisocial and psychopathy, sociopathy, and I also want to do complex PTSD, particularly complex PTSD and psychopathy, because I talk about it so often, and these topics are talked about so often on the internet. But with paranoid, I don't know why it's taken me so long. I think it's just kind of random in terms of which ones I've decided to tackle. But absolutely, and I know what you're talking about, because so I'll tell you, this is just my anecdotal experience, that the public conversation and dialogue about personality disorders has a certain arc to it. With borderline, for example, at first no one knew what it was. Then there was a growing understanding of it, and initially a lot of people only had negative things to say about people with borderline. And it wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be. I was not surprised back then to what am I trying to say? It was my frequent observation that random people in the public, when they heard borderline, assumed that the person was crazy and psycho and abusive and violent and maybe murderous and that sort of thing, because of their very extremely limited and stigmatized understanding of borderline. As time has gone on, though, there has been more talk about it, and I see a shift that people don't automatically assume. If they know it, if they're a layperson and they know anything about borderline, there's a greater chance that they do not have such a simplified, cartoonish, horrible view. Paranoid, though, is in that infancy of understanding and awareness in society. Most people don't know about paranoid personality. Most people don't know about any of the personality disorders outside of narcissism, borderline, and antisocial, right? It would be weird if, certainly there are pockets of people that know schizoid and avoidant and that sort of thing. But anyway, so most people don't know about paranoid. But if they do know about paranoid, similar to lay people who at first started to learn a little bit about borderline, people that know a little bit about paranoid have the exact same assumption that these individuals are abusive and always an asshole and are always a horrible person to hang out with. They're accusatory of you. They assume that you're out to get them, and they are punishing you, and they're actually conversely out to get you before you get them, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's a cartoonish, silly version. Plus, even if there was a profile that was like that, which there are, in the same way that there are people, it's a small percentage of people with borderline personality who are like the cartoonish version I said earlier. They do exist. It's not like it's a fantasy, but it's a very small percentage. Are there people with paranoid personality disorder who could be described and are described by people around them as having those kind of really horrible, negative, difficult traits. Yeah. But there's a lot of other people. There's obviously a spectrum as well. And regardless, underneath all of it is the same sort of traumas that drive any of the personality disorders. So as with borderline, one can, for myself, I'll have a client that is attacking me and this isn't all people with borderline, absolutely, anecdotally, well, if I include people that I know personally, like at work or friends that, are suffering from borderline personality, if I include everybody, then I would say anecdotally 10% of the people that I have encountered with borderline are really difficult to get along with. And, that's not great, but it's a small percentage overall. I would say among clients, though, it's a different population because those are the people that actually need therapy and seek therapy, or their life falls apart such that they end up in therapy. And, it's a greater percentage, maybe 30% or something of the clients that I've worked with. Plus, I specialize in it, so I tend to get referred the obvious cases and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so, yeah, I mean, for those people, it's a rough time to be around them, and I conceptualize them as suffering and having perceptual distortions based on working models that were developed neurologically and logically when they were very young. The way that they see the world is understandable given the way the world was the first 20 years of their life. So I have, these individuals with paranoid or with borderline, because they can actually present similarly in that they both can be, and I'm guessing I'll talk about this at length, and I think I talked about it when I did the deep dive on borderline, or at least I should, in terms of differentials, like what differentiates paranoid from borderline, and how there might be some overlap, and how they might be comorbid more often than not, or they might be correlate. Anyway, point is that when people, family members or coworkers describe people with paranoid, sometimes it can be hard to know if the individual has paranoid or borderline. Once you get into it a little bit and you have the individual describe what's going on for them on the inside, it's to me pretty easy to figure out the difference. But from the outside, it's kind of hard. So, what was I getting at? I forget. I think I was just getting at how both people with paranoid and borderline are stigmatized for unfair reasons. But I and experts understand why someone would exhibit that kind of behaviors and that kind of defensiveness or that kind of hypervigilance about staving off attacks from other people, whether it's, I'll get into it when I do the deep dive on paranoid. So, people with, I don't know if that constitutes saying something kind. Well, you said, please say something kind for people with paranoid. So, I hope I did that. And absolutely, Jane, I just wouldn't go online. And also, most people don't even know of paranoid personality disorder. So I guess that's a good thing at this point because the lay people that do have a very negative point of view. But anyway, so when I do publish the deep dive on paranoid, let me know what you think, Jane, and everyone, including you, Jane. Please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.